Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Roseville Wrecking Ball. The Roseville Wrecking Ball.
Joshua Shrum. He is a very talented steward, very knowledgeable.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball. This is one of those podcasts where I listen to every episode. I love what he's putting out there.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball. Josh Shrum.
Parcels of knowledge. Does a fantastic job with that podcast.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball. He is an Article 8 scholar, and thank God. We need Article 8 scholars right now.
Tune into the Parcels of Knowledge podcast while you're on the route. That's the mailman's playbook, brother.
Good morning and welcome back to Parcels of Knowledge, the podcast dedicated to delivering knowledge to the city letter carrier with your host, the Roseville Wrecking Ball. Today, in the beautiful city of Roseville, we are on grievance number 269. And we have ourselves Wrecking Crew Wednesday. And as per usual, the Wrecking Crew has been growing. Now we're up to 32 members. That is fantastic. These guys are badass individuals who get to have certain perks, like choosing the topic every Wednesday. This topic is Grieving Start Time Changes. And I apologize in advance since I am sick. I will, have a little bit difficulty here, so please bear with me. But without further ado, let's talk about these badass individuals. The Wrecking Crew, we're going to go by name. That will be Rick Steiner, E.R., Tom Perry, Philip DeGilio, Chris Angeloff, Amy Tyvan, Ryan Ackers, Edmund DeVore, Miziel Guzman, Paul Saranowski, Jamie Gregory, Neil Beckman, Shannon Mossbarger, Kenneth Grigsby, Benjamin Shellhaas, Joni Weber, the Allentown Architect, or also known as Still Stacks, Self Care, G Whiskey, Daniel Pitts, Mark Allen Kennedy II, Jason Munn, David Grosskopf, Unfortunate VP, Abraham Askar, Corey Walton, Tyler Christopher, Lena Miranda, Roxy B, The Activist, O.B. Tynes, Angel, and Anthony Arthur Robinson. All right, guys. That's our badass individuals. Now, if you want to become a part of the Wrecking Crew and you get to have a round table once a month and also be able to choose Wednesday's topics, please feel free to sign up. It's over on the episode description. And basically, if you don't know what a Patreon is, it's you're going to be able to donate. It's a value-to-value system. If you feel like this podcast provides you value, you can provide value back. And you can donate between $1 and $50 a month. And that's about it. Now, continuing on, we got a few things to talk about before we get on to the main topic. All right, so let's talk about our interviews. On Saturday, with Shrum, we're going to have Eddie Davidson on. Please submit those questions for Eddie Davidson at rosevillewreckingball@yahoo.com. That will also be in the episode description. I also have a surprise interview, Big Dog himself, and it will be revealed on Friday when it gets posted. Hopefully on Friday it'll get posted. It might get posted overnight. But that's going to be an exclusive Q&A for the Wrecking Crew, my Patreon members. And also, I'd like to talk about the fact that, I posted on Facebook that I created some convention shirts. I got 3 different designs. I got a wrestler, giving management the elbow of education. This, of course, does not promote any violence. This is figurative. I got a shirt commemorating Brian Renfro leaving office. And then I have another shirt that just talks about becoming a wrecking ball. So if you want to check that out, I'll also put that in the description below. I'll be giving away some of those shirts for free in future giveaways. Because it seems like the giveaways I've been doing with the J-Cam and the Stewart references, a lot of people are not claiming them, which kind of disappoints me. But shit, if they don't need these resources, I'll just give away free merch, I guess. But yeah, I think the sales from the merchandise, I'm not even going to get the money back. I set the prices so low, I only make like $3 a shirt. But it's not about making money, it's about being able to provide a very cool convention shirt, something that you can take home and it'll be like a souvenir from the convention. It'll be a Parcels of Knowledge oriented souvenir, of course, which is not what the convention's about, but it's just like one of those few things. I think this convention's going to be really big, so I think it'll be cool to bring home a few different souvenirs. Specifically, the Brian Renfro shirt is going to be really popular, but or at least that's what I assume. But yeah, it's going pretty well, and whatever sales I get, I'm probably going to reinvest, since I don't even have my bank account information on there for them to pay me. Probably just going to reinvest it into giving away free merchandise. That way we can promote the show. Because education is the most important part of it. I don't really care about no profit or nothing like that. But yeah, it's let's get on to the main topic. We're going to go with start time changes and how to grieve them. All right? So let's start with the moving parts of the grievance. We're going to be able to extract any type of important articles of violation from any type of issue statement. So let's go with the exemplary issue statement. Did management violate Article 5 and or Section 122 of the M39 Handbook via Article 19 of the National Agreement when they changed letter carrier start times on a particular date? And if so, what is the appropriate remedy? So yeah, that's correct. This is an Article 5 violation. And why is it an Article 5 violation, Mr. Wrecking Ball? Well, it's an Article 5 because Article 5 essentially it basically solidifies the Postal Service's obligations under the NLRA. Now, do they need to do that? No, they don't, because they got to follow the NLRA no matter what. But the national parties felt it was wise enough to come up with a whole article to dedicate themselves to being in line with specifically the prohibition of unilateral action. Now, the NLRA specifically prohibits unilateral changes in working conditions. That is, conditions involving wages, hours, and working conditions. I know that's I just repeated the same word, but essentially, in between contracts, employers not supposed to just say, you know what, fuck it, we're going to change things that affect your wages, hours, and working conditions without negotiating with the union. So that's where that comes from. You got to use that as part of your backbone of your argument, because a lot of times when we do Article 5s, it's about past practice, because this sort of incorporates past practices. It's not just a past practice article, though. This article prohibits any sort of unilateral change in working conditions. So it reads, the employer will not take any actions affecting wages, hours, and other terms and conditions of employment as defined in Section 8D of the National Labor Relations Act, which violate the terms of this agreement or are otherwise inconsistent with its obligations under law. Article 5 prohibits management from taking any unilateral action inconsistent with the terms of the existing agreement or with its obligations under law. Section 8D of the National Labor Relations Act prohibits an employer from making unilateral changes in wages, hours, or working conditions during the term of a collective bargaining agreement. In C6858, National Arbitrator Bernstein wrote, the only purpose the article can serve, Article 5 of course, is to incorporate all the service's obligations under law into the agreement so as to give the service's legal obligations the additional status of contractual obligations as well. This incorporation has significance primarily in terms of enforcement mechanism. It enables the signatory unions to utilize the contractual vehicle of arbitration to enforce all of the service's legal obligations. Moreover, the specific reference to the National Labor Relations Act is persuasive evidence that the parties were especially interested in utilizing the grievance and arbitration procedure to spell out in Article 15 to enforce the service's NLRB commitments. Bear in mind, not all unilateral actions are prohibited by the language in Article 5. Only those affecting wages, hours, or working conditions as defined in Section 8D of the National Labor Relations Act. Additionally, certain management decisions concerning the operation of the business are specifically reserved in Article 3 unless otherwise restricted by a specific contractual provision. Now, that is the basis of the change. Now, why is the change not governed by Article 3? Article 3 does specify that management has the ability to maintain the efficiency of the operations entrusted to it. And of course, they're going to claim that the efficiency of the operations is the reason why they made the change. Well, let me answer that question. In Article 19 incorporates handbooks and manuals into our national agreement. Article 3 forbids management from making any sort of managerial decision that would conflict with the national agreement or the law. Well, the Handbook M39, which is incorporated via Article 19, specifically lists the factors that must be considered when establishing schedules, and that is Section 122.11. Consider the following factors in establishing schedules. A. Schedule carriers to report before 6 a.m. only when absolutely necessary. B. Fix schedules to coincide with the receipt and dispatch of mail. At least 80% of the carrier's daily mail is to be cased, should be on or at their cases when they report for work. C. Schedule carriers by groups. Form groups of carriers who make the same number of delivery trips whose office time is approximately the same. D. Generally schedule carriers of the same group to begin, leave, return, and end at the same time. E. Schedule so that delivery to customers should be approximately the same time each day. F. Make a permanent schedule change when it is apparent that one or more days' mail volume varies to where it is causing late leaving. And G. Schedule carriers' non-work days in accordance with the national agreement. Okay? So a few of those are applicable in this situation. And that is fixed schedules to coincide with the receipt and dispatch of mail. At least 80% of the carrier's daily mail should be cased. Or should be at the case when they punch in. And, you know, honestly, that's the biggest thing in this Section 122. So that's why a lot of places will tend, a lot of stewards will tend to stick to that 80% caseable mail thing. Now, a lot of times the service will make the argument that packages, which were not considered during this creation of this provision, because they weren't as prominent, they're not ready when the carriers get in, but the mail is. And so that should be considered part of the mail, and 80% of that's not really ready. And that's a bad argument. What I would do if management came up with that argument is that if they wanted to, they can change the M39. They did not. So until they do, it only talks about considering the receipt and dispatch of mail. Mail as in non-packaged mail. And that's the argument that we typically stick to. Now, let's see. In addition, one thing I would like to make sure you have as part of your case file is that National Arbitrator Snow in decision C-23986, he said as follows: it is indisputable that the employer has a right to determine the method, means, and personnel by which operations are to be conducted, and also to make reasonable decisions that maintain the efficiency of the operation. Managerial control of work schedules, however, is not totally unfettered or without limitations. The M39 Handbook specifies that schedules must be fixed to coincide with the receipt and dispatch of mail. The instruction is not a suggestion, but it is stated as an imperative. The handbook, which pursuant to Article 19 of the labor contract has been incorporated into the parties' collective bargaining agreement, eliminates a manager's unfettered control over start times, Start times remain within management's control, but must be exercised after giving due deference to the M39 handbook. Due deference is very important because some arbitrators will argue, oh, well, they only have to give consideration. I think due deference increases the importance that they use that consideration in terms of determining their decision. Now, that was a national arbitration, which is binding, and you can use C7233 to prove that. It says in relevant part, Neil Bernstein said, further, the present national arbitrator is not bound in any way by awards issued by regional arbitrators on this issue. The whole purpose of the national arbitration scheme is to establish a level of definitive rulings on contract interpretation questions of general applicability. National decisions bind the regional arbitrations, not the reverse. So, now you have the moving parts of this grievance. Sometimes you can incorporate other things, like, for example, you can incorporate Article 14 when the change in start time unreasonably results in safety issues. But, like anything else in the case file, you're going to have to prove that. So, if there's any sort of safety concern, you're going to have to get statements or hard proof that is, in fact, something that is in consideration here. So, management cannot make a decision that affects wages, hours, or working conditions that's in conflict with any other part of the handbook or manual. So you have to prove that it is in conflict with the M39 when they made that start time change. So essentially, my first step would be to interview management. Ask for the person who made the decision. Once you identify that person, ask that person a series of questions, and more specifically, you want to ask them why. What did you consider when coming to this conclusion? And if they said that they considered the stipulations in the M39, now you got a higher burden. If they specifically said they didn't consider it, hell, even ask them, did you consider M39 Section 122 when you made that decision? And if they say no, well, then your job's real easy because that's directly in conflict. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do the rest of the job to prove it, but it makes your job a hell of a lot easier. If they say yes, now you have to prove that they unreasonably considered it. And for example, a lot of people focus on fixing schedules to coincide with the receipt and dispatch of mail. But in order to prove that, sometimes you need the reports that management has and other things like uptime, and you're going to need the truck schedules. So examples of things to request would be copy of the notification of start time, unit volume feedback reports, distribution clerk employee everything reports, city carrier employee everything reports, truck schedules and the truck contract for the last few years, and clerk and carrier schedules from a certain time. I apologize for being sick, but the Wednesday must go on. But you want to establish other factors that could lean into management's fault as well. Because if you stick to the 80%, sometimes we lose. I'll give you an example, in fact. Let's see, C document 36821. Arbitrator Gilder. The advocate was Nicole Wheatley. And this was in Mason, Michigan. And I took a part out, and I'm going to read it. In this present matter, it appears the union places undue emphasis on a subclause of one of the factors in 122.11 of the M39 that involving the 80% factor of the carrier's daily mail to the exclusion of all else. M39 122.1 addresses management establishing carrier schedules, and 122.11 addresses factors management is required to consider in establishing those schedules. In the instant grievance, the union focused solely on M39 122.11b and the portion that refers to 80% factor. Simply put, The union states that 80% of each impacted carrier's mail was at his or her case when they reported to work at 7:30 a.m. And since that 80% factor was obstinately met, the agency was wrong for changing the start time. There are several problems with this analysis. Firstly, the union provides no evidence to support its contention of the 80% factor having been met other than informal statements from several carriers that 80% of their own personal mail was available at 7:30 a.m. Nothing was ever introduced indicating the union submitted requests for information from management to corroborate that 80% factor claim, and the file contains nothing more than the aforementioned unverified statements of 4 carrier employees. Taken collectively, these statements don't constitute evidence so much as speculation. See, when you get these statements, you need to make sure it represents a large portion of the employees, not just 4. And you want to establish this is how many people, with an employee listing report, you establish this is how many people work here. This is how many people I got. You want to be overwhelming with how many people testify that 80% of their mail is ready. Also, regarding the union's singular emphasis on the 80% factor, nothing in the M39 122.11 or any other authority requires management to limit its consideration to those factors only. That those factors must be taken into consideration. It appears the agency reviewed the uptime scan as additional data in making its decision to change the begin tour time. Nothing has been introduced to indicate the uptime scan was only information considered, that it was the dispositive element in management's decision-making process, or even that management did not properly consider the factors listed in the M39. Management's personnel, Fowler and, I'm not going to say names, both testified credibly as to their consideration of the M39 factor, as well as spatial constraints at Mason. The scheduling/arrival of the trucks bringing the mail to Mason and the timing of the mail's distribution by the clerks in the decision to change the start time. The uptime scan, which is done after the clerks have distributed the mail to the carriers, was simply another piece of data that went to their deliberations. So I'm going to end the quote there. That tells you that you cannot rely solely on the 80%. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So you want to determine the factors management considered. Like she said, it just says that consider these factors. It doesn't say they have to solely rely on those factors. Now, the due deference gives it a little bit more weight, but when you find out management considered other factors in your interview, you're going to have to prove those factors either wrong or unreasonably, or that they weigh less than the carrier's considerations. For example, and that's why this is very particular. I have to give you general direction. I can't, if you guys want to call me about a specific situation, I may ask you a series of questions and then give you advice that way. But I can't, there's a lot of intricacies in these start time grievances. And I'll give you an example of how it can be drastically different. In my station, we recently filed one. And we've won them before. Last time we won it, it was based on management specifically not saying that they didn't consider the M39. Now this time, they are saying that they did. They also are saying that the main reason why they can't do it is clerk staffing. In fact, they did announcements on it. When I interviewed the carriers, all of them confirmed it was based on clerk staffing. So what I used is the EL 312. In there's a provision that talks about management's obligation to forecast the needs of the business. We had a clerk pass away January of 2025. Since that clerk's passing, we had various CCAs crossing crafts, which I have proof with the grievances that I filed daily. In May of 25, they reverted that full-time position of the girl who passed, citing volume. There's no volume. They continued to cross crafts. So that we have a whole year proving that management did not do their obligation under the EL 312 and forecast appropriately. That is not the carrier's burden to bear. Management is, under Article 3, subject to staffing appropriately. And because of that, it has resulted in late uptimes. And so technically the reasoning is valid, but you got to attack that reasoning with whatever you can. So the uptime, it's valid on its own in isolation, but you can prove that this is seriously management's fault. That for this long period of time, in fact, I filed a grievance for clerk staffing. So for this long period of time, I was even asking them to staff appropriately, and they did not. And so for that reason, they had a whole year. It's not an emergency because that's unanticipated circumstances. So you got to point to the fact that had they staffed appropriately, it would be ready on time. You also want to pull any reports for waiting time to prove that carriers were not waiting for their mail. That's 354. So you want to pull the employee moves report for 354. One thing you definitely have to do is interview carriers. And when you interview those carriers, you want to establish several things. In an exemplary interview, always ask a few different questions. For example, ask them to state their name for the record. Ask them what installation they work in to establish that fact, even though you can pull that from the employee listing report. Ask them about their years of service and how long they worked at that particular station. And then those are no matter what, you got to ask those questions in any interview you do, because those have significant weight on whether or not those statements could be valid. It proves they're from a diverse individuals and all these other things. But also, more specific to this grievance, you want to establish when did they change the start time? Did they notify the carrier? Was there mail at their case prior to starting their tour every day, prior to the start time change? And you really want to hone in on the harm to the carrier, because sometimes with these unilateral action grievances, you can show that the harm to the carrier outweighs the proof of efficiency to the service. For example, in my case, many of my carriers were willing to tell me, I'm really worried because it's the dead of summer. We're about to hit the dead of summer, and you increased our start time by an hour, which will put us outside for an additional 1 hour in the worst time of the day. In addition to that, they cited things like financial issues, like now they can't be on the ODL because they have to make arrangements for childcare, and it affects them twice because now that they're not on the ODL because they have to make arrangements for childcare, that now they have to pay for childcare. They're trying to establish childcare outside of their schedule, their new schedule that's an hour later. So you want to show the harm to the carrier and prove that it affects your wages, hours, and working conditions. It's imperative that you interview as many carriers as possible, especially when it's dramatic harm to the carrier. Now, I would suggest that you have them sign it as well, so that there's no questioning of whether or not that statement came from the carrier, even though it's an interview. Typically, I don't have them sign my interview, but when it comes to Article 5, you want them to sign it, because you don't ever want to lose the case because of the fact that, like Gilder said, they only had 4 carriers sign off. Well, if they question the legitimacy of those interviews because there's no signatures, well then you're not going to have that overwhelming evidence to support your case. Now, for contentions, you just want to establish a prima facie case that all of the elements of the M39 Section 122 are met. And more specifically, the 80% of your caseable mail is there at the current start time. And once you've established that with your documentation and your interviews, you want to establish that prior to the start time change, management failed to properly consider the criteria of the M39. Now, that national arbitration says that management must consider that criteria, give each one due deference, Don't focus solely on the 80%. If you can prove anything else, do it. Ask for truck schedules so that you can show that the trucks get here overwhelmingly early. Sometimes you don't have a case. If the truck schedule changed and it's getting there late, it's going to be difficult. You're going to have to really, really prove a high burden of harm to overcome the efficiency to the operation. Once you establish that prima facie case, the burden shifts to management to prove that it complied with the M39. You want to emphasize that unilateral actions are prohibited by the NLRA under Article 5, which incorporates the NLRA, and that there was no discussion or any type of good faith bargaining between the parties prior to implementing this change. And that, had there been good faith bargaining, management would have had further considerations to consider, such as the union would have brought up the harm that was established in the carrier interviews. So that's essentially the heart of the arguments. And any counter arguments management comes up with, like, hey, I know we have to consider these things, I did, but also I considered this, and that's the reason why. You got to destroy those arguments. It's more about countering management's arguments from then on, because the pendulum is going to swing back and forth between the union and management. And that should all take place at Formal A or lower. It can't take place at arbitration, because everything in the case file is simply everything that could be cited. So all arguments established need to be knocked down. All management's arguments need to be knocked down prior to sending the case file out. You can't just expect your arbitration advocate to be able to figure out what exactly, arguments what exactly the information is needed to fight those management arguments that they posed at Formal A. But I think this episode's long enough. Obviously, for the remedy, I would ask for out-of-schedule premium. Keep in mind, there's been plenty of cases in Region 6, and I'm sure other places too, where out-of-schedule premium is not paid where there is a no-lunch policy, and there's only a shift in 30 minutes of schedule. And the reason being is, out-of-schedule premium is very particular. What it stipulates is that if you're working out of your schedule, then you can have that 50% premium. Well, if your start time was 8 to 4:30, and you usually took a no lunch, made it 4, your schedule's still 8 to 4:30. Then you go into the new change, 8:30 to 5. Well, if you're taking a no lunch still, that's 8:30 to 4:30. That's still within your old schedule. So a lot of times, if it's still within your old schedule, they might not pay out-of-schedule premium. And just remember that if you're asking for out-of-schedule premium for all the carriers, they're going to only give that to you if you can really overwhelm them with what type of harm this caused the carrier. If you're going to ask for a compensatory remedy also, you might want to incorporate Article 41's stipulation that a remedy could be appropriate if a compensatory remedy could be appropriate if it's egregious or deliberate. I would hang on the fact that it's egregious because you want to overwhelm them with the harm. And of course, you want the original start time to be established. If you decide to file this grievance and for whatever reason they come to you in Formal A or informal and they ask you to resolve this and set the time back, don't accept it without a sunset. Because if you sign an agreement saying, hey, yeah, we're going to change the start time back to 8, well, then they can just turn around because maybe they realize they had a bad case. Maybe they said some dumb shit in the interviews. Well, now they can just turn around less than a month later, just change it back to 8:30 and do it the right way this time, where now they know your arguments. Now they know they can preemptively try and defeat your case. Make sure you put a sunset in there if you do that. Like say something along the lines of, it'll be 8 for at least a year. Or if they won't agree to that, it'll be 8. And then in any future considerations of changing the time, management will meet with the union prior to establishing that change and give due deference to the carrier's opinions and the harm to the carriers. If you do that, you can solidify that process. That's sort of lightly established in Article 5 anyway, because any change in working conditions should be bargained for. That's why Article 5 exists. Don't forget, I need questions submitted for Eddie Davidson. That's to rosevillewreckingball@yahoo.com. Please send me some questions. I need some more. Also, if you want to be a member of the Patreon, don't forget to join the Patreon. The more the merry. I think that last roundtable was very successful, and we're planning on having 2 time slots next time. That way, we can do, like, let's say 20 people want to do it now. We can do 10 and 10. It'll be less overwhelming as a group. But yeah, hopefully you learned something valuable today. And as always, have a good day.
If these guys are getting educated, we will be in big trouble.
Management's been weighing you down like a bag of wet catalogs, but you don't gotta take it. You strap on the elbow of education, dig it?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Roseville Wrecking Ball. The Roseville Wrecking Ball.
The Roseville Wrecking Ball is an Article 8 scholar, and thank God, we need Article 8 scholars right now. The Grieving genius and the Roseville Wrecking Ball doing amazing work.
Tune into the Parcels of Knowledge podcast while you're on the route. That's the mailman's playbook, brother.